The photograph sat in a dusty corner of the attic, tucked away in a leather-bound album that hadn't been opened in decades. Sarah Montgomery ran her fingers over the sepia-toned image, her breath catching as she studied the faces staring back at her. The Blackwood family of 1915, standing proudly in front of their newly built Massachusetts estate. William Blackwood, the industrialist, with his stern gaze. His wife Eleanor, elegant yet distant. Their 3 children arranged by height, and standing slightly apart, a young girl in a maid's uniform, her expression unreadable. "I don't understand," Sarah murmured, squinting at the faded inscription, "The Blackwood family and staff, 1915. But something was off. The girl couldn't have been more than 12, far too young to be working as household staff, even by early 20th century standards. And the way she stood, not quite with the family, not quite with the other servants photographed at the edge, in an uncomfortable middle ground. Sarah had purchased the old Blackwood estate 3 weeks ago, a foreclosure sale that seemed too good to be true. A historic mansion on the outskirts of Salem for a fraction of its worth. The real estate agent had been vague about its history, mentioning only that it had remained unoccupied for quite some time. A cold draft whispered through the attic, rustling the pages of the album. October in New England had already brought the first hints of winter. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter, feeling suddenly uncomfortable under the gaze of those long, dead eyes in the photograph. Her phone buzzed. A text from Eric, the local historian she'd contacted about the house's past. "Found something interesting in the town records. Can I stop by tomorrow?" Sarah texted back a quick affirmative, then carefully closed the album. As she did, a small newspaper clipping slipped from between the pages. It was yellowed with age, the headline barely legible, "Local girl still missing after 3 months." The article was dated November 1915, just months after the photograph was taken. Sarah scanned the faded text, her unease growing. 12-year-old Clara Miller disappeared from her home in August. "Authorities have exhausted all leads." The rest of the clipping was torn away. Sarah stared at it, then back at the photograph of the young girl in the maid's uniform. Something cold settled in her stomach. That night, sleep came fitfully. Sarah's dreams were punctuated by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom, light like a child's. Each time she jerked awake, the house was silent, the old timber frame creaking gently in the wind. At 3:17 a.m., she woke to the distinct sound of humming, a simple, melancholy tune that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Sarah lay frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as the soft melody continued for several minutes before fading away. Morning brought clarity and embarrassment at her midnight fears. The house was old. Strange noises were to be expected. She made coffee and tried to focus on her work, editing a manuscript for her publishing firm back in Boston. But her thoughts kept returning to the photograph, to the girl with the solemn eyes. At precisely noon, the doorbell rang. Eric Matthews stood on her porch, a folder tucked under his arm, his expression somber. "I think you should see this," he said without preamble, following her to the kitchen table. He spread out several documents, birth records, newspaper clippings, and a larger copy of the same photograph Sarah had found. "The Blackwood family," Eric began, "was one of the wealthiest in the county. William made his fortune in textiles. They were respected, feared even. But there were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Sarah asked, though something told her she already knew. Eric tapped the image of the young girl in the maid's uniform. "This is Clara Miller. She wasn't a maid." "Clara was from a poor family in town," Eric continued, sliding a birth certificate across the table. "Her father died in an industrial accident at one of Blackwood's mills. As compensation, or perhaps to silence the widow, William Blackwood offered the girl a position in his household." Sarah studied the document. Clara Miller, born June 4, 1903. She would have been 12 in the photograph. "But why dress her as a maid if she wasn't one?" Sarah asked. Eric's expression darkened. That's where it gets complicated. According to town gossip at the time, Eleanor Blackwood couldn't have more children after their third. She desperately wanted a daughter. Their 3 children were all boys. Some said she became obsessed with Clara, treating her like a living doll. That's horrific, Sarah murmured. The Blackwoods controlled this town. Nobody questioned them openly. Eric pulled out another document, a police report. Clara disappeared in August 1915, 3 months after this photograph was taken. The official story was that she ran away. The police investigation was cursory at best. A chill ran through Sarah as she remembered the newspaper clipping she'd found. What do you think happened to her? Eric hesitated. I can't say for certain, but there are inconsistencies in the records. The last person to see Clara alive was Eleanor Blackwood, and shortly after Clara's disappearance, the Blackwoods began renovating this house. Extensive work on the east wing, where the servants' quarters were located. The implication hung in the air between them. Are you saying they... Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. I'm saying nothing was ever proven, Eric replied carefully, but the Blackwoods left Salem abruptly in 1917. The house changed hands multiple times over the decades. None of the owners stayed longer than a few years. Sarah thought of the humming she'd heard in the night. Has anyone reported unusual experiences in the house? Eric looked uncomfortable. There have been stories. Nothing substantiated, of course. After Eric left, Sarah stood in the East Wing hallway, trying to imagine the house as it had been a century ago. The servants' quarters had long since been converted into guest bedrooms, but the original layout was still discernible. On impulse, she began knocking on walls, listening for hollow spaces that might indicate sealed-up rooms or hidden passages. In the smallest bedroom, likely a maid's room originally, she noticed that the dimensions seemed off. The room appeared shorter than it should be, given the external wall of the house. Sarah examined the floral wallpaper carefully, running her fingers along the seams. Near the back corner, she felt a slight draft. Peeling back a loose section of paper revealed older wallpaper beneath, a faded pattern of lilies, and what appeared to be the outline of a door, plastered and papered over. Her heart racing, Sarah fetched a utility knife from her toolbox. It took nearly an hour of careful cutting to reveal the sealed doorway. The plaster crumbled easily, suggesting hasty work. Behind it was a small wooden door with an iron latch. Sarah hesitated, suddenly afraid of what she might find, but curiosity overcame fear. She lifted the latch, and the door opened with a groan of protest. Beyond was a tiny room, no larger than a closet. The air inside was stale, undisturbed for decades. A small iron bed frame stood against one wall. A child-sized dress hung from a hook. On a small table lay a hairbrush, a ribbon, and a diary bound in faded red leather. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the diary. The first page bore a name in careful, childish script: Clara Miller. The diary's pages were brittle with age. Some entries faded almost to illegibility. Sarah handled it with reverence, carefully turning each page as she sat cross-legged on the floor of the hidden room. Clara's handwriting was neat, but clearly that of a child, the early entries filled with observations about her new life at Blackwood Estate. April 12th, 1915. Mrs. Blackwood gave me new clothes today. Not maid's clothes like the others wear, but a fine dress with lace. She said, I'm to take lessons with Master Henry's tutor now, not to work in the kitchens anymore. I don't understand why she's being so kind to me. April 20th, 1915. Mrs. Blackwood watches me all the time. Today, she made me sit while she brushed my hair for an hour. She said I have beautiful hair, just like her sister who died when they were girls. The other servants won't look at me now. May 3rd, 1915. Mrs. Blackwood was angry today because I tried to send a letter to Mother. She tore it up and said my mother gave me to them, that I belong to the Blackwoods now. I cried, and she locked me in my room without supper. The entries grew increasingly disturbing as spring turned to summer. June 8th, 1915. Mrs. Blackwood introduced me as her niece at the garden party today. She made me memorize a whole story about being her sister's orphaned child from Boston. When Mr. Blackwood heard her, his face went all strange. They argued in the library afterwards. I could hear them shouting. July 17th, 1915. Mrs. Blackwood has started calling me Margaret. She says it's a prettier name than Clara. When I forgot to answer to it yesterday, she hit me with her hairbrush. I hate her. I hate this house. I want to go home. The final entry was dated August 3rd, 1915. Mrs. Blackwood came into my room last night wearing her nightgown, talking about her sister. She kept saying I was her Margaret, come back to her. She tried to cut my hair while I was sleeping. I'm going to run away tomorrow night when everyone is at the summer ball. I know how to get to the station. I have money saved. I'm going home to Mother, but Clara never made it home. Sarah closed the diary, a deep sadness settling over her. Whatever happened to Clara after that final entry remained a mystery, though the hidden room and the renovation timeline Eric had mentioned painted a grim picture. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Sarah carefully gathered Clara's belongings. The child deserved to be remembered, her story told. Perhaps with Eric's help, she could find descendants of Clara's family, return these precious items to them. She was about to leave the hidden room when she noticed something scratched into the wall behind the bed, faint marks that might have been made with a hairpin or a nail. Leaning closer, Sarah realized they were words. She is still here. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Sarah froze, her senses suddenly alert. Had that been a footstep? The house settled constantly. It was probably nothing. But then came another sound, the soft, unmistakable humming of the melody she'd heard in the night. "Hello?" Sarah called, her voice sounding thin and frightened in the gathering darkness. The humming stopped abruptly. Sarah stepped out of the hidden room, clutching Clara's diary to her chest. The hallway was empty, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows across the floor. As she turned to head back to the main part of the house, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement at the end of the corridor, a flash of white fabric disappearing around the corner. Without thinking, she followed. "Hello? Is someone there?" The main staircase was empty when she reached it, but now the humming seemed to come from below. Heart pounding, Sarah descended the stairs, following the sound to the formal dining room. The massive mahogany table gleamed in the fading light, and seated at the far end, barely visible in the shadows, was the small figure of a girl. Sarah's hand fumbled for the light switch, her fingers trembling. The chandelier blazed to life, illuminating the dining room in harsh electric light. The chair at the end of the table was empty. "I'm losing my mind," Sarah whispered to herself, still clutching Clara's diary. The stress of the renovation, the disturbing history of the house, her isolation in this new town, it was all catching up to her. She decided to call it a night, securing the house and retreating to her bedroom with a glass of wine and Clara's diary. Sleep would not come easily, but perhaps reading more carefully through the child's words would provide some insight, some closure. Around midnight, as Sarah finally began to drift off, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath clouded in the suddenly frigid air. The bedside lamp flickered once, twice, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. In that darkness, Sarah sensed rather than saw a presence near the foot of her bed. A weight settled on the mattress, as if someone small had perched there. "Clara," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The humming began again, closer now, that same melancholy tune. Sarah lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. "I know what happened to you," she said softly into the darkness. "I found your diary. I'm so sorry." The humming stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence and the weight at the end of the bed. Then, a child's voice, distant as if coming from the bottom of a well. "She made me be Margaret." Sarah swallowed hard. "Eleanor Blackwood. She said I was her sister come back, but I wasn't. I was Clara." The weight shifted on the bed. Sarah reached for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. There was nothing there, but the impression of a small body remained on the coverlet. "What happened to you, Clara?" A cold breeze caressed Sarah's face, carrying whispered words. "She wouldn't let me leave." The next morning, Sarah called Eric as soon as the sun rose, her voice urgent as she relayed her discoveries. He arrived within the hour, bringing along a local medium named Marion, who specialized in historical hauntings. Sarah had been skeptical about involving a psychic, but after the night's events, she was willing to try anything. Marion was a practical-looking woman in her 60s, dressed in a sensible sweater and slacks, not at all the crystal-gazing mystic Sarah had half expected. She listened intently to Sarah's account, then asked to see the hidden room and Clara's belongings. "This child's spirit is troubled," Marion said as she held the small hairbrush, her eyes closed. "She's been trapped here a very long time. Not just her spirit, her story, her truth." "Can you communicate with her?" Sarah asked. Marion shook her head. "It doesn't work quite like that. But I can feel her presence strongly. She's afraid, but not of you. She's afraid of someone else in this house." Eric frowned. "Someone else? You mean another spirit?" "Yes," Marion confirmed. "An angry one. Possessive. It stays in the shadows, watching. The girl, Clara, she's hiding from it." Sarah thought of the presence she'd felt in her bedroom, the small weight on her bed. That hadn't felt threatening, but there had been other moments since moving in. Unexplained cold spots, the sensation of being watched, objects moved from where she'd left them. "Eleanor Blackwood," Sarah said quietly. Clara's diary made it clear she was obsessed with the girl, forcing her to take the place of a dead sister named Margaret. Marion nodded slowly. "That fits what I'm sensing. A woman's spirit, consumed by grief and madness. She still believes the girl belongs to her." "So we have two ghosts," Eric said, "locked in the same pattern they were in life." "We need to help Clara," Sarah insisted. "She tried to escape once. She deserves to be free." Marion's expression was grave. "Freeing a spirit isn't simple. First, we need to understand exactly what happened to her. Why she's still here. The diary ended the night Clara planned to run away," Sarah explained. "She never wrote what happened after." "Then we need to find out," Eric said. "If Clara died in this house, there might be evidence. Hidden spaces, disturbed ground, or records," Marion added. "Death certificates, medical reports, private correspondence. The Blackwoods were prominent. They couldn't simply make a child disappear without some kind of cover story." Eric nodded thoughtfully. "I'll go back to the Historical Society, dig deeper into the Blackwood papers. There's a collection of Eleanor's personal letters I haven't examined yet." As they talked, the temperature in the hidden room began to drop precipitously. Their breath fogged in the air. The small collection of Clara's belongings on the table began to tremble, then suddenly scattered as if swept by an invisible hand. "She doesn't want us here," Marion whispered. "Not Eleanor. She knows we're trying to help Clara." A door slammed somewhere in the house, loud, violent. Then another, closer. Footsteps pounded down the hallway toward them, heavy and purposeful. "We should go," Eric said urgently, taking Sarah's arm. But as they turned to leave, the hidden room's door swung shut with such force that the walls shook. The lock, antique and previously rusted, clicked into place. They were trapped, and they were not alone. In the pitch darkness of the sealed room, Sarah fumbled for her phone, hands shaking as she activated the flashlight. The beam illuminated 3 terrified faces and their clouding breath in the frigid air. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, eyeing the locked door. Marion closed her eyes, her expression tightening with concentration. "Eleanor is extremely agitated. She sees us as intruders, threats to her control over Clara." A low, guttural moan emanated from beyond the door, not the sad humming of a child, but something deeper, filled with rage and possession. "We need to make contact with Clara," Marion said urgently. "She's our ally here. If we can reach her, strengthen her, She might help us. Eric began examining the door. This lock is old, but simple. I might be able to force it with enough leverage. While Eric worked on the door, Marion instructed Sarah to place Clara's diary and hairbrush in the center of the room. Objects with strong emotional connections can serve as conduits, she explained, then turned to address the empty air. Clara, we know what Eleanor did to you. We want to help you. Please, if you can hear us, show us you're here. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then the pages of the diary began to turn by themselves, flipping rapidly before stopping on a blank page near the back. As they watched, shocked, faint marks appeared on the paper, as if an invisible hand were writing with painful slowness. Attic, box, truth. The temperature plunged further. Outside the room, the moaning intensified, transforming into a woman's scream of fury. The door began to rattle violently in its frame. "She's coming," Marion warned, her face pale. "Eleanor knows Clara is communicating with us." Eric renewed his efforts on the door, using a metal hairpin he'd found on the floor as a makeshift lockpick. With a final twist and a grunt of effort, the lock gave way. The door flew open, not from his pressure, but as if yanked from the other side. The hallway beyond was empty but freezing cold, the air heavy with malevolence. "The attic," Sarah said firmly. "Clara's trying to show us something." They moved quickly through the house, the oppressive sensation of being watched following them up the stairs. In the main hallway, a large portrait that Sarah hadn't paid much attention to, a stern-faced woman in Victorian dress, suddenly crashed to the floor, its glass shattering. The attic stairs were narrow and steep, the space above dark and cluttered. Sarah led the way with her phone's flashlight, scanning the dusty relics of previous owners. "There must be dozens of boxes up here," she said, discouraged. "Focus on anything that might belong to the Blackwoods," Eric suggested, moving deeper into the space. Marion froze suddenly, pointing to a far corner where the roofline sloped down. "There," she's showing me. In the corner sat an ornate trunk, its brass fittings tarnished with age. Unlike the other items in the attic, it was free of dust, as if recently disturbed. The lock was broken, hanging loosely from its hasp. Sarah approached it cautiously. "I've never seen this before." As she reached for the lid, a child's voice whispered directly in her ear, "Be careful. She's watching." Sarah hesitated, then resolutely lifted the heavy lid. Inside the trunk were carefully folded children's clothes, dresses from the early 1900s, shoes, ribbons, a photo album. And beneath these, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, a small bundle tied with string. With trembling fingers, Sarah unwrapped the package. Inside was a leather-bound journal, much finer than Clara's simple diary, with the initials E.B. stamped in gold on the cover. Eleanor Blackwood's private journal. "This is it," Sarah breathed, opening to the first page. Her personal account. But before she could begin reading, a violent gust of wind, impossible in the enclosed attic, ripped the journal from her hands, sending it sliding across the floor. The attic door slammed shut. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on the small attic window. And in the darkest corner of the attic, a figure began to materialize, the indistinct shape of a woman in Victorian dress, her face contorted with rage. "She won't let us read it," Marion whispered. "The journal contains the truth she's been hiding." The spectral figure of Eleanor Blackwood drifted closer, her form becoming more solid with each passing second. The air around her seemed to bend and warp, as if reality itself rejected her presence. "We need Clara," Sarah said desperately, searching the shadows. "Clara, help us." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small hand materialized out of the darkness, reaching for the journal on the floor. The diary rose into the air, floating towards Sarah. Behind it, like a faint watercolor painting, the outline of a young girl in a maid's uniform began to take shape. Clara and Eleanor, both now partially visible, faced each other across the attic. A century of captivity, of predator and prey, distilled into a single moment, Clara's form flickered like a candle flame, translucent and fragile against Eleanor's more substantial presence. The child's ghost held the journal out to Sarah, her expression pleading. Eleanor's spirit surged forward with a howl of fury, her spectral hands clawing at the air. Clara flinched, but stood her ground, positioning herself between the woman and the living occupants of the attic. "Read it," Clara's voice whispered, barely audible above Eleanor's rage. "Read it aloud." Sarah took the journal with shaking hands, flipping quickly through the pages until she found entries from August 1915. Eleanor's handwriting was elegant, but increasingly erratic as the pages progressed, the neat script deteriorating into jagged, slanting lines. August 4th, 1915, Sarah read, her voice gaining strength. "The ungrateful child tried to leave us tonight. After everything I've done for her, rescuing her from poverty, giving her a proper home, the chance to be someone worthwhile, I caught her sneaking out with a bundle of her things. When I confronted her, she had the audacity to say she wanted her mother, as if that simpering widow could provide anything compared to what I offer." Eleanor's spirit shrieked, the sound piercing like broken glass. Objects around the attic began to vibrate. Sarah continued reading, louder now. "I had to discipline her severely. The child fought back like a wild animal. She fell, it was her own fault, struck her head against the hearth. There was so much blood. William helped me conceal the accident. The renovations to the east wing will cover all evidence. No one will think to look for a child who has simply run away." Clara's ghost nodded sadly, her form becoming slightly more distinct as the truth was spoken aloud. August 10th, 1915, Sarah read. "I can hear her at night, footsteps in the hallway, her voice singing that peasant song her mother taught her. William says it's my guilt, my imagination. He doesn't understand. My Margaret has returned to me at last, just as I always knew she would." The final entry was dated October 31st, 1915. "She won't leave me alone. The girl, Clara Margaret, whichever she is, she stands at the foot of my bed each night, silent, watching. William has taken to sleeping in the guest room. He says my nocturnal ravings disturb him, but I know the truth. She has chosen me. We are bound together now, in this house, forever." As Sarah read the last words, Clara's apparition solidified further. Tears streamed down her translucent face, tears of release, of validation. For a century, her story had been hidden, her murder concealed behind walls of plaster and lies. Eleanor's spirit, meanwhile, began to distort, stretching and contorting as if being pulled apart by invisible forces. Her howls transformed into desperate, pleading sobs. "Margaret, sister, don't leave me again." Marion stepped forward, her voice firm but compassionate. "Eleanor Blackwood, your sister is gone. This child is not Margaret. You've held her spirit captive through your delusion and your violence. It's time to face the truth and move on." Eleanor's ghost flickered violently, her form shifting between the elegant woman of the portrait and something darker, more decayed, perhaps closer to her true self. "Mine!" she shrieked, lunging toward Clara. But something had changed. The balance of power had shifted. As Eleanor's spectral hands reached for the child, they passed through Clara's form like smoke. The girl stood straight backed and unafraid, shaking her head slowly. "I was never yours," Clara said, her voice stronger now, no longer a whisper. "And now I'm free." A sudden wind whipped through the attic, though no windows were open. It circled Eleanor's spirit, creating a vortex that seemed to pull at her very essence. She fought against it, clawing at the air, at the floor, at anything that might anchor her. "This is her judgment," Marion murmured. "The truth has broken her hold." With a final desperate wail, Eleanor's spirit collapsed in on itself, condensing to a pinpoint of dark light before vanishing entirely. The wind died instantly. The oppressive cold began to lift from the attic. In the silence that followed, Clara's ghost turned to Sarah, a small smile transforming her solemn face. "Thank you," she said simply. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, tears in her eyes for this child she'd never known in life. Clara's form was already beginning to fade, becoming more transparent with each passing second. "Now I can go home," she replied, her voice distant. "My mother is waiting." And then she was gone, leaving only a lingering warmth in the air where she had stood. The house felt different after that night, lighter somehow, as if a heavy shadow had been lifted from its rooms. Sarah, Eric, and Marion sat in the kitchen until dawn, processing what they had witnessed. The physical evidence remained. Eleanor's journal, Clara's diary, the hidden room with its small belongings, but the palpable presence of the past had receded. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, cradling a mug of coffee between her hands. "About Clara, I mean. Her remains must still be somewhere in this house." Eric nodded grimly. According to Eleanor's journal, the accident happened by a hearth. The original blueprints show fireplaces in the main parlor, the master bedroom, and the library. "The library," Marion said with quiet certainty. "That's where it happened. I can feel it." The Blackwood Library remained largely intact, one of the few rooms Sarah hadn't planned to renovate. Its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather armchairs, and imposing stone fireplace created an atmosphere of old-world sophistication. Now, standing on the intricate Persian carpet before the hearth, Sarah saw the room through new eyes. This beautiful space had witnessed a child's final moments, her fear, her pain, and afterward William and Eleanor Blackwood had simply covered it up, renovated, continued their privileged lives while Clara's mother waited in vain for her daughter to return. "The renovations to the East Wing will cover all evidence," Sarah quoted from the journal. What exactly did they renovate? Eric had been researching this very question. According to building permits filed in September 1915, they reinforced the fireplace and chimney, claiming structural issues. They also replaced the original hardwood floors throughout the first floor. "Replace the floors," Sarah repeated slowly, looking down at the herringbone-patterned wood beneath the carpet. "Or covered something up." Over the next 3 days, with the help of a contractor sworn to discretion, they carefully removed sections of flooring around the library fireplace. 6 inches below the surface they found it, a secondary floor of much older wood, stained dark with what might have been blood. And beneath a section that had been clumsily repaired, wrapped in a child's nightgown, they discovered human remains. The Salem police took the case seriously despite its age. Clara's bones were respectfully removed for examination and eventual burial. Sarah provided both diaries as evidence, though she doubted any legal proceedings would follow. The perpetrators were long dead, beyond earthly justice. What mattered now was remembering Clara Miller, acknowledging what had been done to her, and allowing her story to be told after a century of silence. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. "Century-old murder solved. Blackwood family secret revealed." Sarah gave interviews reluctantly, focusing on Clara rather than the supernatural aspects of the discovery. The article included a photograph of Clara with her mother, a simple portrait Eric had found in the town historical archives, rather than the unsettling image of her in the maid's uniform. Through painstaking research in public records, Eric located Clara's closest living relatives, the great-grandchildren of her older brother. They were stunned by the revelation, but grateful to finally know what had happened to their long-lost ancestor. When Clara's remains were finally laid to rest in the Miller family plot, beside her mother, who had died still searching for her daughter, Sarah attended the small ceremony, standing at a respectful distance. Afterward, Clara's great-grandniece approached her, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes that somehow reminded Sarah of Clara's ghost. "Thank you," she said, clasping Sarah's hands. "Our family has wondered for generations. My grandmother, Clara's niece, used to tell us how her father never stopped looking for his little sister. This would have meant everything to him." Sarah smiled sadly. "Clara deserved to be found, to have her story told. Will you keep the house?" the woman asked. It was a question Sarah had been asking herself for weeks. The Blackwood estate was now infamous, its dark history exposed. Some urged her to sell, to distance herself from the tragedy, but something held her back, not a ghostly presence, but a sense of responsibility. "I think I will," Sarah said finally. "It doesn't feel right to pass this burden to someone else, and the house itself isn't evil. It was just a witness. Perhaps it deserves a chance at a new story too." That night, back in the Blackwood estate, her home, Sarah sat in the library with a glass of wine. The fireplace had been carefully restored after the police investigation, the floors repaired. There were no cold spots now, no eerie humming in the night. Yet as she gazed into the dancing flames, Sarah could almost see reflections of the past, not just the tragedy, but the century of life these walls had witnessed. Families had grown here, children had played, meals had been shared, seasons had turned. The Blackwood's crime had cast a long shadow, but it wasn't the house's only story. "Rest well, Clara," Sarah whispered to the empty room. "Your truth is known now. You're free." As if in response, the fire crackled softly, sending a shower of golden sparks up the chimney toward the stars. Spring came to Salem, transforming the Blackwood estate's grounds with bursts of daffodils and cherry blossoms. Sarah had embraced her role as the property's caretaker, researching its complete history beyond the Blackwood tragedy. She discovered that the land had once belonged to the Pennacook tribe before colonial settlement, that the house had served briefly as a hospital during the Spanish flu epidemic, and that a famous novelist had lived and worked here during the 1950s. With Eric's help, she began documenting these overlapping narratives, determined that Clara's story would be remembered alongside the others, not as a lurid, haunting tale, but as a testament to the importance of truth and justice, however delayed. Sarah's renovation plans had evolved as well. Rather than modernizing everything, she focused on restoration, preserving the original craftsmanship while updating only what was necessary. The East Wing, where Clara's hidden room remained as a private memorial, she left largely untouched. On a warm April morning, as Sarah worked in the garden, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. A tall, slender woman in her 30s emerged, regarding the house with visible apprehension. "Can I help you?" Sarah called, setting aside her trowel. The woman startled slightly. "I'm sorry to intrude. I'm Diane Blackwood. William and Eleanor were my great-grandparents." Sarah felt a chill despite the spring sunshine. "I see. I read about what happened, what they did," Diane continued, her voice tight with emotion. "I had to come, to see for myself. My family never spoke of this house or why they left Salem so abruptly. Now I understand why." Sarah hesitated, then gestured toward the porch. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Over the next hour, Diane shared what little she knew of her great-grandparents. William had died in 1932, bitter and reclusive. Eleanor had preceded him by a decade, spending her final years in an asylum reportedly plagued by hallucinations of a child following her through the halls. They had 3 sons, but only my grandfather Thomas maintained the family name. The others changed their surnames, distanced themselves, Diane explained. "I always sensed there was shame in our history, something unspoken. It wasn't your shame to carry," Sarah said gently. "You weren't responsible for their actions." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "No, but I feel responsible now for acknowledging them, for making what amends I can." She reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope. "I found these among my late father's effects. They're letters from Eleanor to my grandfather, written during her time in the asylum. I almost burned them, but then I thought they might help complete Clara's story." Sarah accepted the envelope with mixed emotions. "Are you sure you want to share these?" Diane nodded firmly. "The truth matters more than protecting a family reputation that doesn't deserve protection." Eleanor's delusions continued until her death. In her final letter, she claimed Clara was standing at the foot of her bed every night, waiting. Guilt, Sarah murmured. Or justice. After Diane left, promising to stay in touch regarding any further Blackwood documents she might discover, Sarah sat on the porch swing, contemplating the envelope. Part of her wanted to leave Eleanor's ravings unread, to focus instead on honoring Clara's memory. But as the historian Eric had reminded her, understanding the complete story, even its darkest chapters, was important. The letters revealed a mind unraveling. Eleanor's elegant script had deteriorated further in the asylum, the pages filled with paranoid ramblings about Clara's constant presence, about the child's vengeful spirit following her from the house. In her final letter, dated just days before her death in 1922, Eleanor wrote, "The girl is with me always now. The doctors say she isn't real, that my mind is creating her out of guilt, but they don't understand. She has been waiting all these years, waiting for me to admit what I did. I see now that I will never leave this place. Clara has made sure of that. Perhaps it's what I deserve." Sarah carefully returned the letters to their envelope. Eleanor had lived her final years imprisoned by her own guilt and madness, a fitting punishment for what she'd done to Clara. That evening, Sarah called Clara's great-grandniece to share what she'd learned from Diane's visit. The woman was silent for a long moment after Sarah finished speaking. "So Eleanor never escaped what she did, even after leaving the house," she said finally. "I'm not sure if that makes me feel better or worse about it all." "Justice takes many forms," Sarah replied. In the end, Eleanor faced her truth, even if she never faced legal consequences. After the call, Sarah walked through the quiet house, pausing in each room to absorb its atmosphere. The oppressive feeling that had greeted her when she first moved in was completely gone now. In its place was something lighter. Not exactly peace, perhaps, but acceptance. The house had witnessed darkness, but it had also seen the truth revealed, a long-delayed justice served. In the library, Sarah ran her fingers along the restored floorboards near the fireplace. Clara's remains had been properly buried months ago, but Sarah still felt a connection to the child whose story had become intertwined with her own. "Your family knows what happened now," she said softly to the empty room. "Eleanor couldn't escape what she did to you. You're remembered, Clara. You matter." As spring turned to summer, Sarah continued her careful stewardship of the property. The house's notorious history gradually faded from local headlines, though ghost tour operators occasionally slowed their vans outside the gates, pointing out the Blackwood murder house to wide-eyed tourists. Sarah found she didn't mind. Let people remember what happened here. Let Clara's story serve as a reminder that buried truths had a way of surfacing, that victims deserved to be remembered, that justice, however delayed, mattered. On the one-year anniversary of her move to the Blackwood estate, Sarah hosted a small gathering. Eric brought historical photographs he'd discovered of the house in various eras. Marion, who had become a friend, contributed homemade pastries and her calming presence. Clara's distant relatives attended, bringing family albums that included the few existing photos of Clara as a young child, before she went to work for the Blackwoods. The mood was contemplative rather than celebratory, a commemoration rather than a party. They shared stories about their research into Clara's short life, about the Miller family's decades-long search for answers, about how the truth had finally emerged after a century of silence. "I've been thinking about doing something more permanent," Sarah said as they gathered in the garden. "A scholarship, perhaps, in Clara's name, for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds." Clara's great-grandniece nodded approvingly. She would have liked that. From what little we know of her, she valued education, kept a diary, taught herself to read beyond what was expected for a working-class girl of that time. "The Clara Miller Memorial Scholarship," Eric mused. "It has a nice ring to it." After the guests departed, Sarah walked through the twilit garden, her thoughts still with Clara. The child's ghost had not appeared since that night in the attic when Eleanor's spirit had been vanquished. But Sarah sometimes felt a benevolent presence in quiet moments, not a haunting, but a gentle acknowledgement. As darkness fell, Sarah noticed a light in the east wing window. the small bedroom that had concealed Clara's hidden room. She frowned, certain she'd turned off all the lights before her guests arrived. Making her way back inside, she climbed the stairs to the east wing. The bedroom was dark and empty when she entered, no sign of any light. Sarah was about to dismiss it as imagination when she noticed something on the small writing desk by the window. A single daisy, fresh and white, its stem wet as if recently picked from the garden. Sarah stood very still, her heart beating rapidly. She hadn't brought any flowers upstairs, and none of her guests had ventured to this part of the house. "Clara," she whispered. No response came, no ghostly apparition, no disembodied voice. Just the silent room and the solitary flower in the last rays of sunset streaming through the window. Sarah gently touched one white petal. Perhaps it was nothing supernatural. An open window, a breeze carrying the bloom inside. Or perhaps it was a final farewell, a small token of gratitude from a spirit finally at peace. Either way, Sarah decided to take it as a sign that her stewardship of the house and Clara's story was on the right path. She left the flower where it lay and quietly closed the door behind her. The Blackwood estate continued to reveal its secrets gradually over the following months. During renovation of the old carriage house, workers discovered a cache of letters hidden in a wall cavity, correspondence between Clara and her mother during her first weeks at the Blackwood house. The early letters were hopeful, describing generous employers and comfortable surroundings. The later ones grew increasingly uneasy, with references to Mrs. Blackwood's strange behavior and requests that her mother visit soon. Sarah added these to the growing collection of historical material she was preserving about the house and its occupants. With Eric's help, she began work on a small book documenting not just Clara's tragedy, but the complete history of the property and the various families who had lived within its walls. It would serve as a record of truth, neither sensationalizing the house's darker chapters nor erasing them. Diane Blackwood remained in contact, making peace with her complicated heritage by contributing to the Clara Miller Scholarship Fund and sharing what family records she could find. "I can't change what my ancestors did," she told Sarah during one of her visits, "but I can help ensure it's remembered accurately and try to create some good from it." In late autumn, as the maples around the property blazed with color, Sarah received an unexpected email from a historical society in Boston. They had acquired a collection of photographs from a defunct newspaper's archives, including several taken at the Blackwood estate during the early 1900s. Among them was a candid image of Clara, not posed in a maid's uniform, but sitting on the garden wall, smiling shyly at the camera. Sarah enlarged the photograph, studying the girl's face. Here, finally, was Clara as she had actually been. Not Eleanor's living doll, not a tragic victim, but simply a child with hopes and dreams and a future that had been stolen from her. She had the photograph framed and placed it in the library, not as a morbid reminder, but as an acknowledgement. This house had been Clara's prison, but in revealing her story, it had also become her memorial. "Your truth is known," Sarah told the smiling image. "Your voice has been heard. Rest in peace, Clara Miller." 5 years passed. The Blackwood estate, no longer whispered about as haunted, had become known instead for the annual scholarship fundraiser Sarah hosted on its grounds each summer. The Clara Miller Memorial Scholarship now supported 3 disadvantaged students through college each year, with preference given to those who had overcome significant obstacles. The book Sarah and Eric had written, Echoes of Blackwood, A Century of Hidden Histories, had been published by a small university press, documenting not just Clara's story, but the complete chronicle of the house and its occupants. It sat on a prominent shelf in the library, alongside Clara's diary and the other historical materials they had gathered. Sarah had considered selling the property several times over the years. Each time something held her back, not a supernatural attachment, but a sense of responsibility. She had become the keeper of this house's stories, the guardian of its truths. It seemed wrong to simply walk away. On a crisp October evening, almost exactly a century after Clara's death, Sarah sat in the garden, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The renovation was long complete, the house restored to its original grandeur while honoring the full spectrum of its history. Tomorrow would bring the dedication of a small memorial stone in the garden, engraved simply, "In memory of Clara Miller, 1903–1915. Her truth endures." Clara's remaining family members would attend, along with recipients of the scholarship that bore her name. As twilight deepened into dusk, Sarah noticed movement near the edge of the garden, a small figure in white, barely visible in the gathering shadows. For a moment, her heart raced with memories of that first year, of spectral encounters and cold spots, and humming in the night. But as she looked more closely, she realized it was only a neighborhood child, peering curiously through the wrought-iron fence. Sarah smiled and waved. The child, suddenly embarrassed at being spotted, waved back quickly before disappearing down the sidewalk. Just a living child, not a ghost. The Blackwood estate no longer harbored restless spirits. Later that night, Sarah stood in the library, adjusting the photograph of Clara that still held pride of place on the mantel. The smiling girl in the image seemed more peaceful now, her tragic end balanced by the knowledge that her story had finally been told, her murderers exposed, her memory honored. "A century," Sarah murmured. "You've been gone 100 years now, Clara, but not forgotten. Never again forgotten." Outside, an autumn wind rustled through the maple trees, sending leaves spiraling down like nature's confetti. The old house creaked and settled, as houses do. But the sounds were just sounds, not messages from beyond, not cries from the past. Whatever unfinished business had kept Clara and Eleanor bound to this place had been resolved. Their stories had been told. Justice, in its way, had been served. Sarah moved through the rooms, turning out lights before bed. In the east wing, she paused at the door to what had once been Clara's hidden room. She rarely entered it now. It seemed right to leave it undisturbed, a quiet memorial. Tonight, on the cusp of the centennial of Clara's death, Sarah made an exception. She opened the door slowly, letting her gaze travel over the small iron bed, the simple wooden table, the hooks where Clara's few possessions had once hung. On the table lay a fresh daisy, white and perfect, its petals luminous in the darkness. Sarah stood very still, her breath catching. She hadn't placed it there. No one else had access to this room. A coincidence, perhaps. A caretaker's thoughtful gesture misremembered. Or something more, a final acknowledgement across the veil that separated the living from the dead. Sarah didn't try to explain it. Some mysteries were meant to remain mysteries. Some connections transcended rational explanation. She closed the door gently, leaving the flower undisturbed. That night, Sarah dreamed of Clara, not as a ghost trapped in endless repetition of her trauma, but as the child in the photograph, sitting on the garden wall in sunshine, her future still ahead of her. In the dream, Clara turned to look directly at Sarah, her expression peaceful, and nodded once before turning away. Sarah awoke with tears on her cheeks, but a sense of profound peace in her heart. The past could not be changed. Clara would always be the girl who never came home, whose life was cut brutally short by someone who should have protected her. Eleanor would always be the woman whose obsession and violence had destroyed an innocent life. But stories could be reclaimed, truths could be spoken after a century of silence. Justice could take unexpected forms. And a house that had witnessed darkness could also become a place of healing, of remembrance, of hope. As dawn broke over the Blackwood estate, painting the old walls in gentle light, Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching the neighborhood come to life. The house no longer felt haunted by its past, merely inhabited by it, the way all old places carry the imprint of those who came before. Clara's story had found its ending at last, not a happy ending that had been stolen from her a century ago. but an ending with meaning, with acknowledgement, with a kind of peace. And that, Sarah reflected as she prepared to face the day of commemoration ahead, was perhaps the most any of us could hope for in the end. To be remembered honestly, to have our truths acknowledged, to leave behind something that mattered. "Rest well, Clara," she whispered to the brightening sky. "Your story is safe now."